Have you ever found yourself doing everything right, following all the advice for strengthening your faith, yet still feeling restless deep inside? You pray, but instead of feeling lighter, your prayers seem to weigh you down. You open your Bible, hoping for comfort, but unexpected questions rise up instead of peace. You remain disciplined, sincere, and open to God, yet inside, something feels strained, almost lost, like the faith that once grounded you is no longer working the way it used to. If you've ever been there, chances are a familiar thought follows quickly. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe I've drifted too far. Maybe if my faith were stronger, this struggle wouldn't feel so heavy. But what if these thoughts are too simple? What if the discomfort is not a sign of something breaking, but rather a sign of something growing deeper? What if those moments of insecurity are actually when your faith sheds its surface performance and becomes truly authentic? Today, I want to explore the part of spiritual growth that few talk about, not the flashy, testimony-ready side or the polished church language version, but the hidden, quiet journey. The stage where maturity feels confusing before it ever feels solid. The time when peace disappears temporarily before it returns transformed. The phase when old certainties fade, leaving you with questions you never believed true faith would ask. Stick with me here. By the end, you might not have all the answers, but you just might understand why so much of your spiritual growth felt like losing something before gaining something new. When growth feels like things are falling apart instead of coming together, let's begin with something rarely spoken aloud but profoundly true. Spiritual maturity often feels like disruption before it ever feels like strength. It doesn't announce itself boldly or confidently. Instead, it usually starts as a subtle unease. There's no dramatic collapse, no crisis broadcasted for all to see. Rather, it's a quiet, internal friction. The things that once brought you comfort and reassurance stop working quite the same way. Phrases that used to immediately soothe you now sound thinner, not exactly false, but somehow less sufficient. You can still say them, but they no longer land in the same place inside you. This shift can be frightening because many of us mistake familiarity for depth. When something that once calmed you down no longer does, your instinct might be to think something is wrong, that you are slipping, or that your faith was stronger before and is weakening now. But Scripture refuses to treat discomfort as automatic failure. Take Habakkuk, for example. He doesn't approach God with polished spiritual certainty. Instead, he brings protest, confusion, and urgency, demanding an explanation for the gap between what he believes and what he sees around him. What makes this so significant is that his questions are not removed or softened. They remain intact and visible. The Bible doesn't hurry to make him sound more composed. This is important because it shows us faith can be authentic even when it feels unsettled. Confusion doesn't disqualify rust. Consider the recurring biblical imagery of labor, agriculture's patient toil, childbirths, intense travail, wading through periods of groaning and strain. Deep formation is often described using these metaphors of pressure, slowness, hiddenness, and tension. This alone reveals something vital. Real growth is not always emotionally pleasant. Sometimes it's metabolically costly. It changes how your inner life processes reality and pushes your soul beyond the emotional frameworks that once made everything feel manageable. In everyday life, this manifests quietly. You may become less reactive, but not because you care less. You might speak more slowly, but not because your convictions have weakened. You stop needing instant closure, instant reassurance, or instant spiritual excitement. And because our culture often equates intensity with health, this calmer, slower, less dramatic faith can feel suspicious. You may worry you're becoming dull, lukewarm, or passive. But perhaps what's fading isn't passion, but nervous performance. Maybe your faith isn't shrinking, it's just settling deeper, beneath the reach of your emotions. This is why so many people misunderstand their own spiritual progress. They expect transformation to feel strong, but often it feels disorienting. They expect maturity to feel certain, but often it's more honest. They expect growth to make them feel bigger, but frequently it makes them feel smaller at first, more aware of all they don't control and more aware of how little can be forced. Usually, a turning point comes, though it's never dramatic. At some moment, you stop asking, "Why don't I feel victorious?" and start wondering, what if faith was never meant to be measured by emotional victory in the first place? Once that question opens up inside you, everything else begins to shift with it. When silence shifts from being neutral to something deeply personal, there's a particular kind of silence that unsettles the soul more profoundly than pain does. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the silence of no response. You pray and sense no movement. You wait and nothing shifts. You ask for guidance, and what returns is not clarity but stillness. And the longer this silence lasts, the easier it becomes to interpret it as distance. Many people begin to panic internally in these moments, not because their faith in God has waned, but because their expectations of God's interaction were more immediate than the season they've entered. Often, we're less troubled by suffering itself than by the absence of explanation. If only there were a reason to see, a sign to grasp, a timeline to trust, we could endure so much more. What truly drains the soul is silence without direction. The prophets understood this rhythm intimately. We recall their moments of revelation, the dramatic declarations, public challenges, fiery urgency. But what we often overlook are the long, blank stretches between these moments. Years without fresh messages, visible breakthroughs, or emotional reassurance that their calling remained active. Yet these pauses were intentional and deeply formative. Silence compelled them to stop relying solely on fresh words, and instead live in alignment with what had already been spoken. This demands a very different kind of faith. Consider Anna in the temple. She's often remembered as a brief side figure in another story, but her life exemplifies something vital. Years of waiting, undisciplined devotion in a place likely seen as monotonous by others. Her faith was rarely rewarded with visible signs of novelty. Yet the silence did not erode her attentiveness, it sharpened it. By the time fulfillment came, she was ready to recognize it. This is one of silence's hidden gifts. It trains perception and teaches us to distinguish intimacy from mere newness. Jesus himself experienced this pattern, though it's easy to romanticize if we're not careful. The wilderness isn't poetic when you're hungry, tired, exposed, and strained inside. Silence reveals what truly drives you, stripping away distractions until you're face to face with yourself. It dismantles the illusion that spiritual life can thrive solely on stimulation. In reality, this phase often appears painfully ordinary. You keep doing what you know is right, keep showing up, but no emotional rewards follow. Prayer feels like speaking into still air. Scripture becomes laborious rather than inspiring. Worship no longer sweeps you off your feet. A quiet, weary question arises, not rebellious, just worn down. What am I supposed to do with all this quiet? This question exposes whether your faith is anchored in God's presence or in repeated emotional experiences of confirmation, because these aren't always the same. Eventually, a subtle shift happens. You stop trying to force a response or fix the silence right away. You don't give up. You simply become still enough to allow the stillness to work. This isn't weakness, it's surrender. A mature restraint, like learning that not every silence in a conversation is empty. Sometimes silence is where truth settles into the body. Perhaps this is what happens spiritually more often than we realize. Maybe silence isn't interrupting the process, but is the process, for a time. If so, then the real question isn't why God is silent, but rather, what is being rearranged within me while He doesn't speak as I expected? When the old beliefs no longer hold the same power or meaning. One of the most surprising experiences in mature faith is realizing that what once helped you now feels insufficient. It's not because those prayers, theological formulas, or emotional frameworks were wrong, they were simply partial. The prayers you memorized, the quick theological reassurances, And the simple emotional structures that once made your spiritual life feel organized and safe now seem to hold less weight. They're not broken, but they're no longer enough to support the complex realities you're facing. This can be deeply unsettling because certainty feels like a steady railing to hold on to. Losing that certainty is like standing at a great height with nothing steady to grasp. The story of Abraham offers helpful insight here, not because his journey is simple, but because it is layered with complexity. It begins with a clear call and a promise ID starting point. Yet, as the promise stretches over time, Abraham's faith grows more intricate. He doesn't become more straightforwardly confident as time passes. Instead, he becomes more patient, more strained, more exposed, more deeply human. The delay in fulfillment doesn't bring neat emotional clarity, but rather endurance. This distinction is crucial. Early faith often operates on a cause and effect model. If I act rightly, God will respond accordingly. Obedience brings clarity. Trust promises swift peace. But mature faith tends to lose that mechanical predictability and shift toward relationship rather than formula. That idea sounds beautiful until you realize a relationship isn't something you can automate or control or reduce to technique. For those who grounded their early faith in predictability, this shift can feel like their faith is weakening. But maybe what's happening is more precise than that. Perhaps those early formulas served their purpose for a particular season, and now no longer suffice for the complex spiritual terrain you're journeying through. This isn't necessarily regression. Often it's growth beyond simplicity. In everyday life, you notice this change in subtle ways. You grow slower to judge others, less eager to correct, less thrilled by easy certainties. You become more willing to sit with tension without rushing to resolve it. Since many communities equate sharpness with strength, this softer, slower, and more careful approach can even make you suspect you're slipping or compromising. Yet, the truth may be, you're becoming less fragile. There often comes a moment when this shift becomes undeniable. You find yourself no longer trying to defend God against every question, but are more interested in understanding the people asking those questions. Winning arguments matters less, while perceiving and honestly engaging with others becomes greater priorities. You care less about airtight answers and more about being truly present. This isn't spiritual decline, it's the weight of faith. It happens when faith holds enough ambiguity to avoid panic whenever life grows complicated. So maybe the problem wasn't that old certainties failed, but that they fulfilled their role and are now making space for something quieter, yet far more enduring. And when that space opens, a new tension surfaces, one that few forewarn about. One of the most subtle yet profound costs of growing up is the way it can quietly change your relationships, creating distances you never intended. It's not because you've grown arrogant or believe you're better than others. The shift is far more delicate. Conversations that once sparked your energy now feel empty or shallow. Arguments that previously held your interest fade away. Emotional patterns that once felt normal now drain your spirit. This change doesn't arrive with fanfare or announcement. Instead, it slips in awkwardly, like an unexpected pause in a conversation that used to flow effortlessly. This tension isn't new, it's something biblical figures like Moses and Joseph experienced firsthand. Their growth didn't lead them straight into social harmony. Rather, it isolated them at first. In their time, community wasn't just a luxury or social accessory, it was essential for survival. So when their stories depict them as separated, misunderstood, or moving at a different pace from those around them, it's not a trivial detail. It's a real, tangible cost of their development. Growth often slows us down. You find yourself listening more and speaking less. You become less reactive and less eager to force your point or seek swift consensus. To those still energized by urgency, emotion, and quick judgments, this calm demeanor might appear odd, sometimes even threatening. They may interpret it as distance or, worse, as a form of compromise. But wisdom rarely rushes to be understood. Accepting this is one of the hardest lessons for anyone who still craves approval for their personal pace. In everyday life, these changes are subtle. Group discussions speed along while you pause, choosing not to jump in immediately during debates. It's not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that the timing of your words can change their meaning dramatically. Then the internal struggle begins: am I turning cold? Or am I merely becoming more discerning? There's no easy answer. True grief accompanies this transformation. You miss how effortless it used to be to connect with others, the ease of shared understanding. Growth brings complexity to spaces once defined by simplicity, patience to circles built on urgency, and quietness to settings that reward loud voices. This loss is real even when the growth itself is necessary, so the tension remains, often unresolved. Mature faith doesn't promise a greater sense of belonging. Sometimes it reshapes your connections before it deepens them. Sometimes it narrows your circle before strengthening your closest bonds. And so the lingering question is honest and raw. How do you continue loving people without shrinking yourself? How do you keep growing without letting loneliness turn into bitterness? Many sincere believers find this stage confusing. It's the point where faith no longer has the same dramatic highs and lows it once did. The emotional roller coaster smooths out. The peaks aren't as tall, and the valleys aren't as deep. If no one warned you this might happen, you might think something precious has slipped away. Yet, the pattern in the Bible often points us in a different direction. This shift isn't necessarily a loss of passion, it can be the slow emergence of intention. Take Elijah's story as a vivid example. On Mount Carmel, everything is loud and unmistakable: fire falling from heaven, a public showdown, undeniable spiritual drama. But later on, Elijah encounters God not in grand displays, but in a gentle whisper. It's the same God, just a different way of revealing himself. The text doesn't dismiss the spectacular moments nor idealize the quiet ones simplistically. Instead, it portrays movement and progression. Spectacles can awaken our spirits, but attentiveness sustains them. Emotions have power, but they're unstable, influenced by sleep, stress, hormones, disappointments, expectations, memories. Intention, by contrast, is quieter. It turns up when feelings grow flat. It chooses to pray even when prayer feels empty, to remain present when there's no thrill, and to stay faithful when the atmosphere offers no encouragement. This is where the foundation of faith changes. You stop chasing the next spiritual high as proof God is near. Instead, you build rhythm: small, repeated, daily rituals. Silence. Consistency. Returning again and again with attention. Because our culture equates excitement with significance, this stage can feel underwhelming. You might wonder, shouldn't mature faith feel bigger than this? But depth doesn't always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it steadies us, lowering the need for emotional intensity because what's being built no longer depends on the emotional weather. Usually, there's a moment when this settles and you realize faith is no longer about managing feelings. It's a choice to align with God. You're less shaken by doubts, less controlled by disappointments, less frantic for constant reassurance. This isn't numbness, it's resilience. And resilience rarely feels dramatic while it's developing. So maybe the real question isn't why faith feels calmer now. Maybe the better question is if the emotions feel softer but the commitment remains. What kind of faith is quietly growing beneath the surface? This is the moment when faith stops revolving solely around your own experience. This journey is uncomfortable, and that's precisely why it holds such importance. As spiritual maturity unfolds, your center of gravity shifts. Faith stops revolving solely around your own clarity, your feelings, your peace, your insights, and your sense of spiritual well-being. Not because those things lose value, they don't. They just cease to be the focus. This shift often feels like loss before it reveals its true purpose. Take Peter, for example. Early on, his faith is deeply personal, woven with fear, questions of identity, failures, and eventual restoration. But over time, his focus shifts. Suddenly, it's about feeding the sheep, strengthening others, standing firm, and carrying responsibility. This isn't presented as a moment of triumph or reward instead. It feels like a weight pressing down. And that's something many people don't expect. When faith starts to move away from centering on yourself, it rarely feels noble right away. It feels heavy. You become more sensitive to the pain around you, more conscious of others' vulnerabilities, and more cautious about how your own unresolved wounds might spill into shared spaces. Being ignorant was simpler. Feeling certain was lighter. But compassion carries a cost. In daily life, this transformation unfolds in subtle ways. You interrupt less, listen more patiently, and focus on what's needed rather than what feels rewarding. The journey of growth shifts from trying to impress to striving to become safe for other people's pain, safe in the midst of conflict, safe enough not to weaponize your own unresolved frustrations. This kind of growth isn't flashy or dramatic. It's responsible, and responsibility often feels like a burden before it reveals itself as a calling. There's usually a quiet turning point when you realize your growth is no longer about self-improvement. Instead, you grow so you won't spill chaos onto those around you. So you can respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. So you can stay present, not defensive. So you can carry what passes through you without immediately making it about yourself. This is mature faith, but it doesn't tend to feel like a grand victory. It feels costly. And that brings up yet another question this script won't rush to answer. If faith no longer mainly serves you, are you ready for what it will demand of you when it becomes something others depend on? This is the essence of understanding that letting go isn't coldness, it's wisdom. One of the most challenging lessons in developing a mature faith is learning to let go without becoming hardened. It's not about cutting people off or emotionally disappearing. Rather, it's about loosening your grip, releasing your hold on outcomes, timelines, and the need to fix what isn't yours to fix. This isn't indifference. It's a form of discernment. Yet, initially, it feels dangerously close to detachment. In Paul's later letters, we witness this transformation, whereas his earlier writings buzz with fiery urgency and confrontation. His later messages still carry intensity, but are infused with grief, patience, and clear boundaries. His love remains profound, but he no longer bears responsibilities that aren't his to bear. In a world of vulnerable churches, constant conflict, and relentless pressure, this approach isn't withdrawal, it's a survival strategy rooted in wisdom. Early in faith, we often believe that if we care enough, pray long enough, and push persistently, everything can be changed. But mature faith brings a humbling reality. Some things don't align with your timeline. Some people won't respond. Some misunderstandings won't resolve neatly. Some prayers don't unfold in ways you can control. Practically, this translates into choosing peace over constant engagement, not chasing closure in every conversation, or carrying every fractured relationship as your own personal burden. You continue to love and remain available when it's appropriate, but you no longer force outcomes simply to dodge discomfort. That feeling can initially seem wrong. You might ask yourself if you're giving up, growing weary, or losing compassion. But usually, there comes a moment of clarity. The emotional burden lightens. Not because the situation improved, but because you've stopped assuming responsibility for results that were never yours to carry. You still care deeply, but you are no longer trying to play God in someone else's journey. This isn't laziness, it's maturity recognizing limits. Yet the tension stays alive. How do you stay tender without being overwhelmed by what you can't control? How do you remain engaged without burning out your soul in the name of care? When maturity means living inside unresolved tension. This might be the most challenging change of all, the recognition that maturity doesn't erase tension. Instead, it teaches us how to live with it. Early faith longs for swift closure, clear endings, neat explanations, and tidy moral conclusions. But as the story of Scripture unfolds, Tension evolves from a problem to be solved into a space where trust grows. Israel existed between promise and fulfillment for generations, not just days or months, but entire generations. From the inside, this felt exhausting, not poetic. Jesus often responds to questions, not with simple answers, but with rich, layered stories. His teaching goes beyond mere information. It transforms how we see the world. He deliberately leaves things open-ended because living in that space shapes us differently than quick resolutions do. In real life, this transformation feels odd. You start making decisions without every feeling neatly sorted. You move ahead while still carrying unresolved doubts. You stop demanding perfect clarity before you obey. This isn't surrender, it's stability. It's faith learning to operate without perfect conditions. Usually, there comes a moment when you notice you're less unsettled by uncertainty than before. You're not unraveled as easily by disagreement. You no longer feel pressured to resolve every tension just to remain present with it. This is one of maturity's deepest signs, not because the questions vanish, but because your soul stops panicking whenever they remain. Flexibility begins to outweigh rigidity. And this flexibility is what prevents faith from breaking under pressure. So perhaps the more meaningful question isn't how to eliminate tension, but who you are becoming as you carry it. When strong faith stops needing to appear strong. Let's cut straight to the point. Spiritual maturity quietly transforms what we think of as true strength. At first, strong faith often comes across as loud, confident, and fast, armed fully with Bible verses and ready answers. It speaks quickly and doubts rarely cross its path. It feels forceful and certain, but as time passes, that kind of strength begins to show its cracks. It leans too heavily on everything making sense and being explainable. That's where Job's story shakes things up. His friends hold tight to old definitions: clarity, cause and effect, spiritual certainty, moral equations. But Job finds strength, not by solving the mystery of his suffering, but by refusing to lie about his pain. The text never romanticizes his suffering, but it deeply honors his choice not to fake a resolution. That difference is key. Mature strength doesn't have to seem unshaken. It grows quieter, slower to judge, and more able to stay present in hardship without rushing to fix it. In everyday life, this doesn't look flashy. You don't panic when enough questions arise. You don't feel the need to prove your faith in every conversation. You're comfortable admitting you don't have all the answers without feeling threatened. At times, you might even wonder if you've lost your edge. But maybe you've gained something far sturdier. Often, when someone near you is falling apart, you don't rush to fill the silence with explanations. Instead, use it with them. You listen. You stay present. Later, you realize it wasn't your certainty that helped them most, it was your steadiness. This is a different kind of strength. Not the impressive, showy kind, but bearing strength. The strength that holds pain without denying it, stays present without trying to control it, trusts without pretending to understand it all. This kind of faith may not look powerful from the outside, but it sustains what louder faith often cannot. When growth feels lonely, remember it's not abandonment. It's evolving into a strength that quietly carries through the hardest storms. One of the toughest realities to embrace is that growth can feel isolating, not because God has abandoned you, nor because those around you have intentionally let you down, but simply because your personal development sometimes outstrips the pace of your surroundings. This phenomenon is clearly illustrated in the story of Elijah after the dramatic events on Mount Carmel. After such intensity comes a period marked by collapse, silence, exhaustion, and the need to recalibrate. In that solitude, Elijah isn't being punished. Rather, he is recovering and reorienting himself. This lesson remains true even now. Society often teaches us to link growth with outward visibility, high energy, and social approval. Yet spiritual maturity tends to unfold differently. Inner alignment comes first, with visible fruit appearing later. This shift can be unsettling if you're accustomed to measuring progress by others' recognition. In practical terms, this means that the habits and disciplines you practice in private hold more significance than those public moments of apparent progress. Prayer carries potency, even when unnoticed. Discernment blossoms in places that seem uneventful from the outside. Sometimes, this path may even make you feel less socially understandable or connected than before. However, there often comes a pivotal turning point where loneliness transforms into spatience as a space to listen, to perceive, to appreciate that presence matters more than performance. Connections are then measured less by their volume and more by alignment. The question, though still challenging, becomes clearer and more compelling: am I simply drifting away from others, or am I learning to move at a pace that my soul can sustain? Now, consider the paradox that mature faith eventually unveils. It is possible to become more stable without achieving complete certainty. Peace can deepen even as questions endure. Mystery doesn't vanish. Instead, it ceases to dominate your experience. Think of Simeon and Anna, figures who embodied a faith marked by long waiting, quiet perseverance, and understanding without full explanation. David's later prayers reflect a similar stance: not a life devoid of pain, but a voice calmer amid suffering. Mature faith transforms your relationship with unresolved matters. What once overwhelmed and disrupted you now invites contemplation and reflection. You no longer demand immediate answers or react intensely to every emotional swing. You recognize that trust isn't synonymous with full understanding. Typically, this realization dawns quietly. True peace is unturned by resolving every question, but nurtured through steadfastness, attentiveness, and a willingness to remain in honest communion with God even when outcomes remain unfinished. Mature faith feels less like reaching a destination and more like learning to journey forward on an endless horizon. You don't possess the entire panorama, but you've gained the capacity to keep moving. Spiritual maturity isn't about having all the answers. It's about holding both faith and doubt without surrendering either. It's about staying truthful, present, and steady even when clarity is incomplete. Far from representing weaker faith, this may be its richest and most profound expression. Have you ever found yourself confusing discomfort with failure, silence with abandonment, uncertainty with weakness, or complexity with decline? What if those subtle, quiet changes inside you aren't signs that something is dying, but rather signals that something shallow is being shed, making space for something deeper and more authentic to grow? Faith that matures doesn't always bring immediate relief. Often, it can feel slower, tougher, quieter, heavier, more honest, and come at a greater cost. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. It might mean it's becoming real, in a way that can truly sustain the life ahead of you. So, take a moment and reflect honestly. Where in your life have you mistaken tension for failure when it might actually be formation? What if the moments in your journey that feel the least remarkable are actually the very places where profound depth is being cultivated? If this message resonates with you, share it with someone who is quietly carrying a similar tension. And if you stick around for the next message, we'll explore even deeper the kind of patience faith requires when growth happens beneath the surface, with no visible proof yet to show for it.